Hello. So for this video, we're going to be talking about Higuchi Ichiyo's short story, Separate Ways, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. We're going to do this in honor of Lunar New Year, which is coming up the Tuesday after this video will be posted. Happy New Year to all of you who celebrate. So Ichiyo is this really interesting figure because she's one of these kind of literary savants who, at least according to the Norton editor's introduction and critical biography, she's one of these sort of literary savants who shows up periodically throughout literary history and just overcomes all of these odds against becoming a writer to produce this brilliant, revolutionary literature. Ichiyo, whose birth name was Natsuko Higuchi, wrote under the pen name of Ichiyo Higuchi. She was born quite poor. Throughout her life, her family was quite poor. She suffered frequent losses in her family. She was born in 1872, which is actually really significant in terms of her place in literary history. But she was born in 1872. She only lived about 24 years. She died in 1896. And during the late 19th century in Japan, women were not generally entitled to an education, and Ichiyo does not seem to have been formally educated. She seems to largely have been an autodidact. That is, she taught herself to read and to write. Maybe she didn't teach herself to read and write as such in the sort of basics of it, but she taught herself to read and write critically and creatively. So she didn't have a formal education, but she had this brilliant literary mind, and she took whatever sort of basics she had available to her, and she applied those skills critically to both become a quite renowned literary analyst, particularly of the Tale of Genji, which she became quite after her literary success. Students would sort of request that she would come and lecture to them about the Tale of Genji, even though she was not formally a scholar. She was a poor woman who lived on basically sort of the outskirts of Tokyo's red light district, and she had struggled her whole life, and she did not have sort of proper literary mentors. The closest she had to a proper literary mentor was a guy named Nakurai Toshioi. And he wasn't a good writer. He wasn't his style was sort of hackneyed and falling out of fashion in late 19th century Japan, and so he was a terrible role model for her. But Ichiyo seems to have, without access to sort of contemporary Japanese scholarship and without access to Western literature, which is, again, part of the reason that the 1872 birth date is really important, she seems to have created her own style that reflected a crossover between what in the West was emerging as realism or naturalism and an emerging Japanese modernism. So the 1872 birth date is really significant because in 1868, something monumentally important for modern Japanese history happens, which is that the Emperor Meiji ascends the throne. This is sometimes called the Meiji Restoration, or the Meiji period. And the reason that this is important is because earlier prior to the 1860s, right? Prior to 1868, we'll call it that basically. Well, call it prior to 1860. Japan was completely isolated, almost completely, right? Like in the entire country, there was one Dutch trading post that was allowed. Other than that, no foreigners, nobody who is not Japanese was allowed to be in Japan. And this was enforced. It was an extremely isolated nation. And one of the things that this meant was that they did not have access to the technological advances that had been going on in the rest of the world. So it was a primarily agricultural society. It still functioned under a feudal order. But in the 1860s, Japan starts to feel the pressure of potential colonization. And they look at places like China, which wasn't colonized by the West, but was divided into spheres of influence during what's sometimes called the Century of Humiliation, where Chinese power was basically non-existent internationally. And Emperor Meiji and his government basically sort of look at one another and they say, listen, chaps, one of two things is going to happen here. Either we stick with the old shogun system of government and an agricultural society that's still essentially feudal, at which point we get conquered and colonized by the West, or we modernize. And they chose option B. Japan in the Meiji period modernizes rapidly. They industrialize agricultural production to a certain extent, right? They start bringing in like farm machinery and things like this. They start bringing in farm machinery. They modernize the military. That's a huge thing. They bring in, they buy modern weapons from European industrial countries, and they start learning to make them themselves. They build their own factories, etc., etc. They modernize tactics. They bring in advisors from France, from Germany, from the United Kingdom, from all of these different European places that are colonizing elsewhere in the world. And the Japanese learn from what all of these military advisors know. They modernize the government, going from a feudal system to a constitutional monarchy. It is a massive sea change in Japanese history and culture. So from around the time that Ichiyo is born, I mean, the Meiji period goes up until 1912, basically. So throughout her entire life, she's living through this modernization. And one element of Meiji modernization was that Japanese students and scholars go from studying just Japanese texts, Buddhist texts, Confucian texts, things like this, Shinto religious doctrine, etc., etc., and they start studying Western literature, which during this period is realist literature or naturalist literature. So people like Flaubert, like Tolstoy, these sorts of people who are writing these very sort of direct depictions of everyday life with a socio-critical edge. And Ichiyo has no access to this, right? Because she is not educated. She's just not a student. She doesn't have any sort of formal learning whatsoever. But she emerges in this period and again seems to sort of construct this style of her own out of whole cloth that combines these elements of Japanese traditional literature with the modern focus on realism. And a lot of this is inspired by her own life, right? Where she lived in these very poor areas. She was around people who were suffering, who were at the bottom of the social ladder, who experienced various kinds of deprivation, poverty, etc., etc. And she herself dies quite young because of this. Again, she dies at age 24 from tuberculosis, brought on by a life of poverty, exposure, and bad food, right? But she becomes this incredibly well-known literary figure in Japan because her writing is doing the kinds of things that Japanese scholars are starting to recognize in the Meiji period as incredibly important for Japanese modernity. So let's talk about Separate Ways itself. This is a short story. It's quite a short story. It's really not very long. And it features really two characters, primarily. There is Okio, who is a sort of attractive young woman working as a seamstress on the borders of Tokyo's red light district. Not necessarily that different from someone like Ichiyo herself, although I don't know that she is necessarily the inspiration for this. But certainly the kind of person with whom Ichiyo would have been very familiar. And then there's Kichizo. And Kichizo is a young man. He's 16 years old. He works as an umbrella oiler. That is his job. He is an orphan. He seems to have some sort of physical disability, perhaps a form of dwarfism. Whether or not it's sort of properly a form of dwarfism, he's nonetheless quite short, but he is quite muscular. He's quite tough, and he. So because he is an orphan and he does not know who his family is, this actually creates a lot of problems for him. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But one of the sort of pervasive elements of Separate Ways is this sense of fatalism, this sense of sort of the impossibility of life getting better, particularly for Kichizo, who sort of deeply believes that nothing good will ever happen to him, and anything resembling something good that does happen will be tainted in some way. And this is an interesting thing, because his friendship with Okio is a good thing for him, right? He regards it as a very positive thing. He actually says he wishes that she were his sister, in part so he would have some family, which is incredibly important in East Asian cultures traditionally, but also just so he would have a connection with someone. But this sense of fatalism, so very early in the story, so right at the start, Okio is sewing at night. She's making this garment, a nice kimono for New Year's. Great overlap there. Kichizo shows up to basically sort of borrow her fire to fry rice cakes. And so she said, it says here, she took up her sewing again. The owner of the pawn shop on the corner ordered it to wear on New Year's. That's the kimono that Okio is sewing. I'm going to add, so this is one of those sort of realist stories where dialogue is not always clearly indicated. So I think I'm going to tell you who's speaking when someone's speaking, because it's easier to read on the page than it is to follow. So Kichiyo says, what a waste on that old baldy. Why don't I wear it first? Okio says, don't be ridiculous. Don't you know what they say? He who wears another's clothes will never get anywhere in life. You're a hopeless one, you are. You shouldn't say such things. Kichiyo says, I never did expect to be successful. I'll wear anybody's clothes. It's all the same to me. Remember what you promised once? When your luck changes, you said you'd make me a good kimono? Will you really? He wasn't joking now. Okio says, if only I could sew you a nice kimono, it would be a happy day. I'd gladly do it. But look at me. I don't have enough money to dress myself properly. I'm sewing to support myself. These aren't gifts I'm making. She smiled at him. It's a dream, that promise. And it sort of goes on like this, basically. And sort of the general sort of gist of this opening portion is that Kichiyo is convinced that nothing good will ever happen to him. And he's sort of made peace with that, right? He accepts that he is an umbrella oiler, that is his job, and he's good at it. He doesn't like being as short as he is because he gets made fun of all the time. People call him dwarf. And so there's this very sort of abusive situation that he finds himself in because of his physical stature. And he's not thrilled with that. But he believes that good things will happen for Okio. So what he says here is, even if someone came along and insisted helping me, I'd still rather stay where I am. Oiling umbrellas suits me fine. I was born to wear a plain kimono with workman's sleeves and a short band around my waist. To me, all good luck means is squeezing a little money from the change when I'm sent to buy persimmon juice. If I hit the target someday shooting arrows through a bamboo pole, that's about all the good luck I can hope for. But someone like you, from a good family, why, fortune will come to greet you in a carriage. I don't mean a man's going to come and take you for his mistress or something. Don't get the wrong idea. He toyed with the fire in the brazier inside over his fate. And so this is sort of Chekhov's gentleman, I suppose, in a way, right? The introduction of this idea by Ichiyo early in the story that someone will come and make Okio their mistress, and that will raise her out of poverty. And that is ultimately what ends up happening. At the end of the story, she comes and tells him that she is going to be moving, that is happened quite suddenly, and basically they are probably not going to see one another again. And he takes this basically as a personal betrayal, and this is a really interesting bit because it's hard to tell what sort of the ethos is here, right? Are we supposed to be sympathetic with Ichiyo for his feeling of betrayal, particularly given all of the loss that he has experienced in his life? Or are we supposed to feel that he is selfish and begrudging Okio her success? And I'm not 100% sure. And I think that's part of what's so interesting and brilliant about Separate Ways, is that we don't have an ethical judgment from Ichiyo about these characters. We simply have the characters presented in their positives and their negatives. So at the end of the story, I'm going to read you the last portion of it. Okio says, "What's the matter with you? You're acting funny. Is it something I said? If it is, please tell me. When you stand around with a long face like that and won't talk to me, it makes me worry." And then Kichizo has this lengthy bit. "You don't have to worry about anything. This is Kichizo from the umbrella shop you're talking to. I don't need any woman to take care of me." He rubbed his back against the pillar. "How pointless everything turns out. What a life. People are friendly and then they disappear. It's always the ones I like. Granny at the umbrella shop and Kinu, the one with short hair at the dyer's shop. First Granny dies of palsy, then Kinu goes and throws herself into the well behind the dyers. She didn't want to marry. Now you're going off. I'm always disappointed in the end. Why should I be surprised, I suppose? What am I but a boy who oils umbrellas? So what if I do the work of 100 men? I'm not going to win any prizes for it. Morning and night, the only title I ever hear is dwarf, dwarf. I wonder if I'll ever get any taller. All things come to him who waits, they say, but I wait, and all I get is more unhappiness. Just the day before yesterday, I had a fight with Hanji over you. Ha! I was so sure he was wrong." Hanji is another person in the umbrella shop who told him that Okio was going to go off with a man. I told him you were the last person rotten enough to go off and do that kind of thing. Now 5 days have passed and I have to eat crow. How could I have thought of you as a sister? You with all your lies and tricks and your selfishness. This is the last you'll ever see of me, ever. Thanks for your kindness. Go on and do what you want. From now on, I won't have anything to do with anyone. It's not worth it. Goodbye, Okyo. He went to the front door and began to put his sandals on. She says, Kichizo, you're wrong. I'm leaving here, but I'm not abandoning you. You're like my little brother. How can you turn on me? From behind, she hugged him with all her might. You're too impatient. You jump to conclusions. Kichizo says, you mean you're not going to be someone's mistress? Kichizo turned around. She says, it's not the sort of thing that anybody wants to do, but it's been decided. You can't change things. He stared at her with tears in her eyes. Take your hands off me, Okyo. So again, I think it's a really, really brilliant ending to the story because, again, it doesn't have that sort of moral judgment of one of these characters is right and the other is wrong, or both of these characters are right or both of these characters are wrong, right? We don't know what conclusion, what ethical stance Ichiyo wants us to draw about them. And I think that's really, really fascinating. It's such an interesting technique because it opens up the potential meaning of the story.